Okay, as we sort of hit 2 minutes past now, what we'll do is we'll sort of start to get into the webinar itself. So you are at the Esri UK Orientated Policing Solution webinar. So you'll have two hosts today, Dave Tong from the Public Safety Tech Enablement team, and myself, Kyle Chapman, the Public Safety CSM at Esri. We'll take you through the webinar. We've got some general terms around housekeeping. The webinar will be recorded. A link will be sent afterwards to yourselves via email, along with a copy of the slides shown today. As already mentioned, for those that have just arrived, we are using Slido for questions and answers, so we won't be answering as we go, but you can submit questions through Slido. So www.slido.com, and the password's #Esri3004, or you can scan the QR code on the screen. Once again, we ask if you can submit your questions with the name and the police service you're part of, just in case we need further clarification. It's always a bit nicer than having anonymous questions in the group. Like I said, we'll share a lot of the output afterwards. In Slido, you can upvote questions as well. So maybe someone's already asked one that you were thinking of, and you can ask away and upvote that one to the top, and we'll look to get to that first. So without sort of further ado, today we'll sort of go into the webinar now. We're a couple of minutes in, and we'll probably start with, I guess, why we are where we are and why problem-orientated policing sort of approach with Esri. So it really all comes from where police forces are looking to understand the challenges that they were facing, and that there were several sort of common themes that were emerging around public pressure and a pressure to deliver effective crime reduction strategies to address not just crimes but also societal problems. Recently, the government as well has heavily invested directly into things such as violence against women and girls, serious violence, antisocial behaviour, all as part of initiatives for targeted response to address some of these societal priorities we've mentioned. There's been a requirement to identify and prioritise the problems I've mentioned, and policing has a lot on its plate, and if everything is a priority, then sort of nothing is sometimes. And the typical method for disseminating information about the problems we've mentioned, which is typically through email bulletins, large PDFs, a lot of that information can be lost, can take a lot of time to update, is easily forgotten, and that there's a need to sort of document and visualize these area problem profiles, simply prioritize responses and the resources to tackle those problems. There's been a lot of pressure around bringing an evidence-based and a scientific-based approach to policing. So when crime problems are encountered, response plans are often ineffective because they're not tailored to the nature of the problem and they're not informed by evidence. And you can actually respond with standard strategies which aren't specifically focused, and it can apply a bit of a scattergun or scattershot approach to the problems without understanding whether they're truly being effective. And by building the evidence base and involving scientific scrutiny around things such as control areas and our targeted response plans, we can figure out what works and apply that in the best way we can to ensure that we can repeat the same effective plans in different areas. There's been a push around being accountable or being empowered. I think is probably better. Being empowered, where officers, inspectors, sergeants, everybody understands why they're carrying out that response activity, why they are potentially being tracked or being asked to give feedback, whether it's intelligence, whether it's anecdotal, community engagement pieces of work, being asked to provide that back to senior management teams to understand what's working, how we're engaging with the local communities, how is that making an impact against the priorities and problems that have been identified. And that allows the command teams to monitor correctly how are they performing against the key problem areas that have been identified, and again continue to improve that evidence base and see how you can replicate those strategies elsewhere in your own police service, but also in other forces that have similar problems. Which is where you get this real issue around evaluating successes. So being able to sit down and understand the clear goals that you set for your responses. How was it implemented? Were there any obstacles in implementing those plans? What effects has policing intervention had on those problem areas? How did we remove the guesswork? How do we take a data-driven approach? And what were the meaningful lessons that we learned that make it possible to establish best practice over time? And also one of the most important ones is communication. So how do we inform not just our staff that we're doing the right things, not just our officers, but how do we inform the public? How do we share good news stories with the public about the time that we're spending in problem areas, reducing crime, making places safer, making places more secure? How do we share that information with the PCC's office so that they can understand the work that the police force is doing, and they can share that information again out to the general public so that they can see the good work that the police are doing, which often isn't highlighted. So that's why we've looked at problem orientated policing and some of the key themes that we've seen coming through and key pressures on policing. And so we sort of took a step into then looking at, well, what does a successful problem orientated policing workflow look like, with reducing crime, part of the mission for local policing at the centre of it. Part of the issue is that the current process is often resource intensive, usually brought together by Excel spreadsheets, anecdotal feedback around performance, and delivered through ad hoc ad hoc implementation of response plans. So being able to actually tailor the approach, so identify the specific problem areas using a data-driven methodology, understanding the science and the evidence behind why you're going to implement that response strategy, being empowered to do that, monitor that performance regularly, and also shorten the feedback loop, so it's not taking a long time to get that feedback. It doesn't take months to understand, are we meeting our compliance rate? Are we delivering the amount of engagement we had planned for that problem area? And can we find that out on a weekly basis rather than once a month or once every 3 months, or once it's become a problem, and we're not meeting what we set out to do originally? And ultimately, it all comes down to increasing transparency and trust. So again, being able to share that with the public, with the communities that you're engaging with, that you manage to get those communities on board with what you're doing and seeing the good work that policing does on a daily basis. And then that also brought us in because we're fully aware that that's what a successful workflow looks like, but there are obstacles to this, and places like the College of Policing, a lot of this information is identified, and technology that we'll go through today is only a part of the solution, but also identified where issues around training. So we need to understand that this is a complete transformation incorporating people, processes and technology, and I think that's why it comes down to being able to be empowered and be held accountable to the plans that we set out and to the interventions that we enact, and being able to report that back to management, to the Home Office, to various places that have a vested interest in the great work that you're doing. There's a huge amount of access to technology as part of training as well, and free online training courses in both the technology but also the problem orientated policing toolkits. Can that information be easily found by officers so they know not just where the problem area is, but what are they doing when they're in there? So we've got to bring those into a solution, a workflow that works for police officers, works for analysts, works for senior management, and works with you rather than against you, or is just another task to do. We need to offer time and resource to the response and the interventions we prescribe. As you can see there, a lot of the feedback we've had from police forces, you get dragged onto response, you get dragged onto other activity. That may still take place, but at least having somewhere to record that and to understand, well, why didn't we reach the compliance levels in that area? Why didn't we reach the goals we set out? Well, actually, there were operational restraints on what we did, and things changed over time. And that, therefore, we've actually got that evidence base. We can understand why the data looks the way it does, and we can start to understand how do we improve that in the future. So you're really shortening that feedback loop. You're understanding how you can improve your approach, and you're overcoming some of these obstacles that have been identified previously. However, being said, there are police forces doing this in bit parts with Excel spreadsheets and trying to bring it all together. But when it is done right, police services have shown that problem orientated policing responses in the past have huge benefits around crime reduction, around overall social benefit, but also around cost savings. So 3 areas that policing often looks at when building business cases, when looking at how can we improve the service we deliver to the public, how can we deliver cost savings to the taxpayer and better use their money and deliver value for money, and how do we deliver a more safe and secure society and deliver societal benefit. It has been proven to do that. So this was just taking you on the journey of how we've engaged with forces to understand problem-oriented policing, the obstacles you face, why you're looking in to do it. So I think without sort of much further delay, what we'll move into is a demonstration of the workflow and the solutions and applications that we've got around problem-oriented policing that allow you to understand more of how Esri can help yourselves.
Okay, great. Thanks, Kyle. So as Kyle mentioned, what I'm going to do today is talk you through the main elements of our problem management solution. So there's 4 components I want to discuss, which starts with the analyst using desktop tools to identify and understand where the hotspots are so we can define the problem areas. We then hand over to a sergeant or an inspector who's going to define the response plan. How are we going to take action to drive down crimes in those locations? Then we're going to hand over to the wider community, who they want to be able to review and understand the problem profiles that we've captured and whether they've been successful. And then finally, we're going to hand back to the analyst, who's going to look at the impact of our response plan to see has it been successful and what are the statistics behind it. So let's start off in desktop. So this is a analytical tool that allows analysts to visualize crime data, understand trends, and define hotspot areas. For this demo, I'm using Hertfordshire as an example, and I've downloaded some of the open crime data from earlier in the year. Now, when I turn on the crime data and it's visualized by crime type, it's not really giving us a good feel for where these problem hotspots are. We can see just lots of clusters. So I want to change the way the data is displayed so we can start to understand a little bit more about this information. To start with, I want to filter down to just one particular crime type that I'm going to analyze. And for that, I can open up my crimes data here, and I've got some predefined definition queries that allow me to very quickly filter the crime data to those areas of interest. So if I choose antisocial behavior, click OK, the display will update to now just show me that antisocial behavior crime points. Now we're starting to get a feel now for where these key locations are, but it still could do with a bit more clarity. So I'm going to change the way it's visualized. So rather than having a series of points, I can choose to create a heat map. More specifically, I'm going to choose to create a dynamic heat map. And the reason I'm choosing dynamic, because that allows me to zoom in and get more and more detail as we go closer to street level. I'm going to adjust the radius slightly so we've got slightly more constrained clusters. So already, just purely through this visualization technique, we're starting to get a feel for where some of the hotspots are. And if I zoom in, I get more and more detail as I get closer to the ground. So we can clearly see there's a hotspot in Hemel Hempstead here that perhaps we'll come back to in a moment. So that's a really good way of understanding at a high level where some of these key locations are, but it doesn't provide me any statistical information that perhaps allows me to rank areas by crime volumes. For this, I'm going to join this crime data to this grid to create a coverage that shows me where the key hotspots are. Now, I like using grids because their uniform size makes them very easy to understand and interpret when the analysis is finished. But this could be any geography you're interested in. It could be LSOAs, it could be postcodes, districts, neighborhoods, whatever you're interested in. So the specific tool I want to use is Summarized Incident Count. But before we run this, I'm just going to turn off the heat map symbology. So we'll go back to a single symbol. And now I can run the Summarized Incident Count. So my input features are going to be the grid. The summary features will be the crimes. And we're going to create a new data set called instant count. I'm going to set that running. So what this is doing is it's going to calculate the number of antisocial behavior crimes in each of those grid squares and then visualize it in a way that I can very easily interpret and understand. I'll turn off the crimes data so it makes that a little bit clearer. And we'll turn off the underlying grid. So you can see the outputs here very clearly. It's starting to define, well, where are the key locations where perhaps we need to take action. And each one of these points has got attribution behind it that gives us that actual count. So if I click those two locations in Hemel Hempstead, I can see the grid ID and I can see the total count. Now it might be that I want to filter this data down to perhaps just the top 9 or 10 key locations. To do that, I can open up the data that we've just created and I can look at the underlying attribute table, because this will give us a count for every one of those grid areas. And I can order this data by the count volume. So we can now see that if we're interested in maybe the top 9 or 10, anything 17 and above is going to be those key locations that perhaps we're most interested in. So I'm going to do another definition query, and I'm going to say I want to see just data where the total count is greater than or equal to 17, and apply that, and that's going to update the display. So I'm just seeing those top 9 key locations. So this is the sort of thing you could use for grip funding if you're asking the Home Office, or could be used as part of any problem-orientated policing approach, because it's really defining very clearly where these key locations are. Now I've done this, I perhaps want to capture one of these areas with a problem profile. Now the two areas that leap out to me are Hemel Hempstead and Watford, but let's look at whether we've already got action in some of these communities. So I can turn on my crime problems layer, and this is showing me the locations where we currently have got initiatives in play already. Now there is already something happening in Watford, so I think Hemel Hempstead perhaps makes a good location to create a new problem profile. So we're going to zoom down to this location. I'm going to turn off my instant analysis to turn the crimes back on again. So I can now see the distribution in this area, and I'm also interested in seeing whether we've got any calls from the public that perhaps we want to include as part of this analysis. So it's quite clear that this is the area we're most interested in. So I now want to capture that as a problem profile area and provide a little bit of extra detail. So I'm going to create a new crime problem, and I'm going to very quickly digitize the area of interest. When I've defined the area, I can update the details of that problem site with all the usual information you capture as part of a problem profile, though. So the who, what, where, why, when, etc. So we're going to start off by giving it a name. I'm going to copy that because we're going to use that again in a moment. It's a new problem because we've just captured it. I can define a date where we ran the analysis. The problem source is analysis. I can choose the district. Now notice that I've got drop downs to try and make the population of this as easy as possible. I can choose from a list of problem managers who perhaps might pick this up next. I can give it a priority. I can choose a type. And then we get into all the key information that you perhaps want to populate as an analyst. So what's the characteristics of the victims, the offenders, have we got information about the place, the temporal profile. So all of this information can be captured at this point. Now to save time, I'm not going to make you suffer through me trying to type all of this out, but hopefully you get a feel for the fact that we can fully document this problem from an analytical perspective through this approach. What I also want to do is I want to associate these crimes and these calls with this problem, so I know the crimes that are related to this particular issue. So for that, I'm going to select all of those locations, and we can now see that we've had 5 calls for service and 46 crimes. Now it's very easy to update the details, so I'm choosing calls for service, and I'm going to paste in the problem name we used previously, apply that, and similarly, I'm going to do that for the crime as well. And you'll see why this is important in a moment. So what we've done as part of this analytical technique is we've defined where the key locations are. We've captured that as a specific area where we think a response is required, and then we've associated all the calls and crimes for that location to that particular problem profile. At this point, as an analyst, we're probably happy to hand this over to an inspector or a sergeant who's going to take this a little bit further. So for that, I'm going to go over to our second application, which is our problem response planner. Actually, I've realized I've just forgotten something. I'm just going to save those changes we've just made. Because what I'm doing here is I'm using one source of data that's going to propagate through all the applications and demos I'm showing you today. So when we go back to the dashboard here, we can see that Hemel Hempstead ASB location that we've just captured has appeared in our problem response planner that's designed for use by the inspector. Now, what this application is doing is it's allowing us to review all the current problems that we've got across our force and document our response plan for each of those. We're also getting a view of the different types of problems we've got. So I can see through this dashboard that we've got 2 new problems and there's 3 that have got an active response. I can see that we've got quite a lot of antisocial behavior and violence problems. We've got 1 for vehicle crime, and only 1 of these is classified as high priority. Now this dashboard will dynamically update as we interact with it. So if I wanted to filter down to just look at the high priority problem, I can see that that's the Bournemouth violence issue here. So it's a really nice way of getting a feel for the problems across our area. Now, if we look at Hemel Hempstead, when we select that, we can jump over to the map and we can see the boundary we've just captured. And because we associated the crimes and calls to that location, it's listed them as part of this dashboard environment too. I can see the details that the analyst would have documented. So we didn't spend a lot of time documenting it for the demo, but that would all appear in this location. And then finally, I've got the option to create a response plan. So I can adjust the priority if I so wish. I can define the response goals. So using SMART type objectives, I can say, okay, well, what do we want to do? How are we going to measure it? Is it achievable? What's the time frames? I can reference advice from around the world. So we've included various information from crime agencies such as the College of Policing, who've shared lots of information through their crime reduction toolkit here. So to make it easy to find, we've referenced those as part of this response planner. I can complete the strategies that we're going to use. I can provide details of any community related activity that's already ongoing. I can document the resources that are required, how many officers do I need over what sort of time period, and I can define a coordinator that's going to support me on this project. Then finally, down at the bottom here, I can define the date when we're actually going to start responding to this particular crime problem. So very easy to complete, very easy to document, and then that would get shared with the wider community, which we'll touch on in a moment. The final box at the bottom here is allowing me to update the status. So once I've finished the analysis and planning phase and we're going into the active response phase, I can update the status so that then we know that this is an ongoing plan that we need to monitor. When I change it to response ended, so it might be that we've had officers on patrol, they've been doing some great work with the community, I then want to document, okay, well, was that successful? So within here, I can say, yes, it was successful, or no, it wasn't. I can provide details of the evaluation. I can look at the statistical evidence, which we'll touch on a little bit in a moment. and I can document all this information about whether this is successful and why it's successful. Because that's really important when it comes to reviewing these response plans at a later date. So that's probably a good point to hand over to the next application, which is sharing that information with a much wider community. So the look and feel of this dashboard is very similar to what I've just shown you, but it's got two key differences. The first one is this is showing me all crime problems, regardless of whether they're current or not. So we can see at the bottom here that we've got a response that has already ended and been evaluated. The other thing is this is read only. So this is not for people documenting the response plan, because that's what the inspector's looking for. This is to provide information to the wider community. So that might be senior officers who want to track progress. It might be officers on patrol who just want to understand, well, how are we responding and what's the patrol area. So it's a really nice way of sharing it out with that wider community. When we look at one of these, we can see the problem as it was first documented. So this is an example where Hertfordshire Police were trying to address vehicle crime in the Panshanger location, and they did that by having more patrols and engaging much more with the community. So they were going around checking door logs, and if they found that a car was open, they'd speak to the resident to perhaps notify them about keeping safe and approaches to crime protection. And the good news here is the response goals were met. So it's been evaluated. We've done a statistical analysis to assess how effective the crime reduction has been, and we can see it has seen a decrease. And the nice thing about this is because you can review all previous responses, if one's really successful, it might be that you start taking that best practice and applying it to other areas. So this viewer is a really important tool to get that information out to the much wider community. The final web application I want to show you is about, well, what do we do if there's a crime problem that gets raised through something other than an analytical approach? So I showed you at the beginning how we could use a desktop environment to capture information through that analysis workflow. But maybe the community themselves have reached out and said, well, there's a problem perhaps in Berkhamsted, or you've had contact with the local council who say there's things that need to be addressed. This is a very simple web app that allows me to capture that information through this environment instead. So if I zoom down to Berkhamsted, it might be that through engagement with the community, we've been told that there's a problem with violence in this particular area. So I can very quickly capture this through this application. So I'm going to digitize my response area, and then I'm going to be given all the same options that the analyst was given through the desktop environment. So I will give it a name. I will give it a status. I can choose a type. I can choose the date for today. Now, again, I'm not going to document all of this to save us time, but you get the impression that I can capture this through this web environment as well. And when I create that, that's then going to feed into exactly the same process as we've been using so far. So when we go back to our response planner here, we'll see that that has just popped up. So Berkhamsted violence has come up on our dashboard. We've got a map that shows us the location, and we can start capturing our response plan in exactly the same way as I've just shown. So those are the web applications to allow you to plan your response and share that out with a wider community. What I want to do now is go back to desktop to start doing some analysis about, okay, well, how successful was this response? Now for that, we've got a tool that's been developed by our colleagues in the States called weighted displacement difference. And what this tool does is it allows us to analyze the impact of our response on an area, but also the surrounding communities. So we want to understand, has crime gone down in the location we've been patrolling, but also have we just pushed that crime out into the community, so has it diffused out? Now, to use this tool effectively, we need a control area. So that control area needs to be of a similar size and have similar crime volumes. So we've got a response area, which is Hemel. We've got a control area that's Hatfield, and we're going to use the two to see, well, how effective has our response been in Hemel. So if I run this tool, so I need to choose my response area, and within that, I need to choose the specific problem we're looking at. So we're looking at Hemel Hempstead ASB. I need to define a control area. The input incident features, so this is going to be the crimes. So for the crime data, we need crime for the entire response period, and we need a similar period that took place before. So if we were responding for a month, then we need the month before to compare it to. I can give my output a name. I need to pick the start and end dates and choose the date field within the crime. And then finally, at the bottom here, I can choose the displacement distance. So this is the area around the response site that we're going to analyze to see if we've just pushed it out into the community. When I run that, it's going to generate me boundaries that reflect the areas we're looking into, and also provide me some output in a very clear English format to help me understand how effective our response plan has been. So that's just about finished. So you'll notice that we've got the response areas and the diffusion zones around each of these sites. And when I view the details, we've got this nice graphic that helps me understand how successful this has been. So at the top here, it's saying this statistical test finds moderate evidence of reduction in the response area during the treatment period. So that's all pretty good. It's also looked at a displacement of 500 meters. And we can see in the response area, crimes dropped by 12, which is a 26% drop. In comparison, the control area saw a rise of 50%. So in the area where we were targeting the response, we had a drop in crime, whereas generally it looked as though crime was on the rise. So that's pretty good. Then when we look at the table, we can see, well, what happened in the displacement areas. So in the response displacement area, we had only 3 crimes pre the response, and then post the response, we also only had 3. So there was a 0% change. So that's good news, because it means that we weren't pushing crime just out into the wider community. So this is a really nice tool to analyze crime at a variety of different levels. It's not enough just to say, okay, in the response zone it went down, because we're not including a variety of other factors. So hopefully you found this presentation interesting. Before I hand back to Carl, I just want to recap on what I've just shown. So we started off with the analyst defining those key locations where we needed to develop a response plan. We then handed that over to an inspector who was defining the plan as to who's going to be involved and how we were going to measure success. That can be shared out with a much wider community so that everyone else can see these response plans, so they can actually include it as part of their workflows. And then finally, we went back to evaluate the success of our response using that new analytical tool. So hopefully that's all been really interesting. Please do put questions in Slido if you'd like to understand a bit more about the technicality here. But otherwise, I will hand back to Kyle. Over to you, Kyle.
Thanks, Dave. I'll just switch the screen over, make sure I'm going to the right monitor I've got now. So yeah, I think just following up on the tools that you've shown there, Dave, and to summarize, you summarize applications, I'll summarize the workflow really that we've looked to embed alongside it, because we mentioned at the top as well that it's not just about the technology, it is about a solution that helps actually empowers the whole workflow and the people and the processes with it, and that there's a series of capabilities that are tailored to the needs of local policing, that improve awareness of crime and disorder problems, that implement responses and ensure accountability, that help you evaluate responses and establish almost a playbook of best practice, and how that will help with increasing transparency and public trust through being able to have better communications, all of which is designed to help identify the community and the neighbourhood problems that you're facing, manage those through an evidence-based approach, evaluate the response effectiveness, and as we've already said, share with those stakeholders, whether they are internal partners, public, Home Office. There's a clear defined workflow clear defined workflow to get the defined outcomes that you set out to achieve. It's all held in one system, in one place, and gives the abilities for analysts through to operational officers of knowing where to go to find the information you need to do the job that you need to do. So what we'll probably do is just sort of head across to Slido now and see if there's any sort of questions that have come through. Hopefully it sparks some thoughts as we've gone through Dave's examples around antisocial behaviour. I kind of see a uniformed approach here being established, whether that's for burglary, antisocial behaviour, road traffic collisions, and Vision Zero sort of aspirations as well. There'll be plenty of analysts on here that hopefully we've got the cogs turning in ideas, whirring in your heads. As to what can be achieved. So I'll just have a little look at Slido and see what questions have come in and I need to answer.
Carl, it might be a good idea to share the Slido link again, just in case anyone hasn't got that.
Yeah, so if you're looking to share or go on to Slido to ask a question, www.slido.com, and the password for the webinar is #ESRI3004. #ESRI3004. You can see roughly sort of 50 people in there at the moment. If there are any questions, please, but also if there are questions and you would like to sort of do them, share them offline as well, no problem with that. As we've said, we'll share the recording of the webinar today with yourselves, along with a bit of a briefing pack, so that sort of covers everything we've gone through in the demonstration and in the slides themselves, and we can sort of pick up any Q&A around those, any additional questions you might have that are for specific later date.
Okay, well, I'm happy to take a couple of questions while we're waiting. And what I'll do, Carl, if I take ownership, because I've got the Slido screen up in front of me, so I can just share that QR code again.
Yeah.
Okay. Right, so hopefully you can see me and you can see the Slido link now. So some of the questions that have come in already. So we've had a question about whether the harm or severity score could be implemented into the statistical function. So yeah, absolutely. Behind the scenes, it's basically just a Python script. So you could start implementing other factors into that. So if there are certain crimes that are more severe than others, then that can be included. It's also worth noting that when I showed this output, down at the bottom here, there is a this score that says statistically how important the findings have been. So we could maybe add another factor in here that also includes harm. So certainly I think that could be introduced. Then we've got a question
on so there's a question about what basically where can the solution be deployed on-prem SaaS. So answer to both is yes. So can be deployed to Force on-premise kit. You might have a Force Azure environment, Windows, AWS as well, could be deployed into that. As we also have a software as a service platform, Archis Online, so it can be deployed through that as well. So all three are options depending on where your Force is up to on their cloud sort of IT journey.
Okay, great, thanks, Carl.
I think Amber at West Yorkshire, if I've understood the question correctly, how do you access the problem response planner and viewer? I'm guessing can it be done on a mobile device, or can it, must it be on a laptop, etc.? Can be viewed on a mobile device, can be viewed on a laptop, tablet. So yeah, it all change behind the scenes depending on what device you're viewing it on. You'll get the right user experience from a police officer's or analyst's perspective.
And then there's a question, Jules from South Yorkshire, asking whether the weighted displacement stats can be exported out for reports. Yeah, absolutely. So that final page that I showed you can be copied to clipboard and then exported out into a variety of different formats. So that's all good. Where can this solution be deployed? So on-prem or SaaS. So I was showing you the solution through our software as a service deployment, which is Archers Online, but it can also be deployed to enterprise. So regardless of whether you're interested in a cloud platform or you want it behind your own firewall, then that's all, both entirely possible. Amber from West Yorks was asking, how do you access the problem response planner and viewer? So those were both web applications. So we started off in the desktop environment for the analytical work, but after that we were just using web apps. So they are accessed with a user login. So you would have your own login to ensure that you're controlling access to that environment. So the inspector or the sergeant would have access to that dashboard, whereas you'd share the view with a much wider community. So it's all online, very easy to access to make it as easy as possible for everyone.
So I think there's two that are the same here, Dave, and maybe one for yourself. So Catherine, I think Hampshire, Isle of Wight. How do we decide on the exact boundaries to use when setting up the problem profile? How important is it to have the exact boundaries? And I think Sarah at Gloss Poll has basically said, could you expand more on how you chose your comparison area for the evaluation and how did you determine the suitable area? So I think both quite similar about how do we come up with that as the geographical boundary around the problem area when you've done sort of your scanning and analysis phase?
Yeah, so it's important when you do that weighted displacement analysis that you're comparing like with like. So if you've got an area which has seen hundreds of crimes and you're trying to compare it to an area that's only seen a few, that's not a fair comparison. So there is tolerance there, so it doesn't need to be exact, but you want to look for an area that's roughly the same size and got roughly the same crime volumes. Now the tool will warn you, so there's an option to say warn me if this area isn't appropriate, so that you can try it with a location which you think is good and then maybe adjust that based on feedback from the tool. But it's really just to make sure that the statistical evidence is as valid as possible and that we're giving you the best answers we can.
Another good one, I think, from
shall I take another question from Jules, Carl, which is around which app was used to create the dashboard. So within ArcGIS, we have a dashboard app. So all it is a configuration of our out-of-the-box tool. So easy to set up, easy to use, and yeah, provides the solution I showed today. And then Carl, you didn't cover Andy Grumel's one, did you?
No.
So the hot and getting hotter, hot but reducing. So you're exactly right, Andy. There is a tool within our desktop environment that does that. So we can look at changes over time to see, okay, is an area going up? Is it going down? Is it a little bit spotty as it jumps around? So that's called temporal analysis, and that's included as part of our desktop solution. So yes, absolutely, you could use the weighted displacement tool. You could use the temporal profiling to get a feel for, okay, well, what has changed over time.
Yeah, so I think on to the next one. Each element you've shown is separate licensed product, desktop, web apps, etc. So there are sort of an overlap of licenses. So you've seen some desktop. Yes, there is a desktop product where the analyst will be doing the majority of the work to do that sort of data crunching and the analysis phase, the scanning, and that will also be the license that's used to create the along with the creator license, the web apps. Once they're made, you've got viewer licenses, so there tends to be a much higher ratio of people that are viewing it, officers, etc. A very small amount of people actually creating the web app and getting that started from scratch and doing the analysis phase. So similar to probably how you're set up now, but it's licensed to sort of match that and cost it appropriately. I think linked, since I've just sort of mentioned around the desktop versus the web, and desktop being a bit, as typical GIS is, heavier lifting and a lot more work around it. Mandy, your question around all data being added manually or linked to a database, the answer is both are possible. We've taken you through how you can do it manually. Again, what we've experienced talking with forces is there's a lot of Excel spreadsheets. There might be some work that needs to be done on the data when you're bringing it out of Niche, when you're bringing it out of Connect or Red Sigma, or you bring it out of your command control. Maybe everything's going into a data warehouse and you want to be using that SQL sort of database and you want to be pulling it out of there. So we're agnostic to where it comes from. We're not sort of aligned, take data from any of them. How that's a manual process, or what we can do is set up a bit of an FME sort of call, bring that data in automatically. Both are options basically. It depends on the analyst, and again trying to fit in your workflows and how you like to work, because I think that was one of the obstacles we highlighted at the start, is it needs to fit in with your business practices. And then I think there was another one around restrictions on police data online. So yeah, so that's exactly why. So I think, for example, I think the question was around SaaS, on-prem, etc., or cloud. Agnostic, so again, can be applied and delivered into any of those. So it can be software as a service with police data being brought into an online software as a service environment. It's all FedRAMP, ISO accredited. So again, as part of DPIA and those sort of conversations, we've been involved with them across the board with any crime analysis that's been done with Esri products for the past 20, 30 odd years. So we can sort of have those open conversations about what data is going in, how long it's stored for, who's controlling that data, who's viewing that data, so on and so forth. And then again, with a little bit of a tint on it, depending on, do you want it in the Esri software as a service platform, or do you want it behind your own firewall on a on-premise, or have you got your own forced cloud environment? So same questions, slightly different answers depending on your the chosen delivery approach, but it's something we've been through with half of UK police forces using Esri currently, so it's something we can cover quite easily with data protection officers as and when those conversations arise. Is the that's one there. Can the POP dashboard be rebranded with our logos on, etc.? Dave, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, absolutely. So very much so. So you can change the color scheme, you can change the logos, you can change the wording. So it all can be configured very easily to reflect the look and feel that you'd expect as part of your force. So that's a big part of it, trying to make it your own.
And I think
I'm not seeing any others, Carl.
That's the sort of last question we've got. So I think without any more sort of popping up on the screen just now, as I said, we'll share the recording. You'll get an email afterwards with some contact information if you want to reach out with more questions. And what we can do is we'll get back in touch, and we can follow up on any questions you have after this webinar. So thank you very much for attending today, and I hope you have a good rest of the day. And yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Cheers.